Welcome to the EKBJJ Podcast. My name is Eddie Kone and I'm the host and founder of this show. I hope everyone out there is doing well. Firstly, let me welcome you to our very first video podcast. I was one of the few people that were chosen to be able to use these video podcasts on the Spotify platform. And I'm very, very happy and very pleased that I'm able to share this with you. So this is episode 21 and we're going to call this season 2. So it will be season 2 but episode 1, although it's podcast 21, if that even makes sense. But I'm very, very happy to be here doing this podcast with you guys. Today's episode, we're going to talk about traditional Jujitsu or traditional Gracie JiuJitsu versus the new school Jujitsu. Now, before I get into that, as always, I would like to give a quick shout out to my sponsor, Atama Kimonos Europe. Atama Kimonos Europe make all of our Academy kimonos, and I believe they make some of the finest kimonos. You can find them at atamaeurope.com. For information on me and my academy, you can find me on Instagram at EKBJJ. So let's get straight into today's podcast. Now, it's not going to be a very long one. It's just going to be a kind of few minutes of me discussing this subject because this was raised to me earlier in the academy by a student. And what she said to me was, Professor, what is the actual difference between Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and the new school Jiu-Jitsu? And I said to her this very simply: it's the difference between fundamentals, very, very strong fundamentals, and the difference with not so solid fundamentals, but positions which are being used that we consider advanced techniques that new school practitioners are teaching the students to be basic techniques. So in the early-ish 90s, I began to train Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Now, my journey took me from the UK here in London and took me out to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where I arrived at the Gracie Academy. Now, the Gracie Academy then, when I was inside the academy, I didn't know I was among these icons of the industry. I just went in, and there were a load of black belts, white belts, blue belts, and I began to train. Now, had I known back then what I'd known now, I would have perhaps paid more attention to what was being taught to me then. But one thing that was really paramount to me was the focus to detail and the way that the lessons were structured, how each lesson led on to the next lesson. So if you started week 1, say, and week 1 was trap and roll, for example, then week 2 would always be, if it was trap and roll, then you would be underneath fighting from the closed guard. So the answer to the question that the student asked me was the differences and how they differed. Now, if you go back to the early days, there was a heavy focus on self-defense. There was striking, there was punches, kicks, knees, elbows, slaps. All of this kind of stuff was involved in Jiu-Jitsu. In the new school Jiu-Jitsu, we don't see much of that, where their primary objective is to focus on point scoring, medal winning, playing a game around a set of rules. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with either of those methods of teaching, but for us, we happen to choose the method of the old way or the traditional way. And a primary example of that is when I began to learn Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. One of the things that happened to me was I was placed inside the closed guard, and so I was on the bottom, I placed someone in the closed guard and they would strike at me, and my objective would be to sweep them or submit them or negate the punches. And the first few times I did this, I found it very, very daunting, very, very, no one had ever done that. Put me on my back, closed guard, and started to strike me. So that was a complete eye-opener. Now, when we talk about self-defense, we also talk about the master text, if you like, the curriculum, the stand-up self-defense from surprise attacks. People often get this confused with, that will never work, and etc., etc. It all works. Anything works as long as you give it enough time and enough practice. It will work. Repetition, timing, and everything that comes with that. So fast forward a few years, and I had visited Brazil for a very short period of time. I think it was 2 weeks. Went to the Gracie Academy, trained there, and then returned to London. Now, I didn't go back for a couple of years after that. But what happened was, in 1993, I came across a a VHS recorder. And the VHS recorder was the UFC. I'll never forget the cover. It was an animated cover. It was almost like a yellow and blue and green, if I remember. It had an octagon, and it said, "There are no rules." On the flip side of it was some really grainy pictures and some text about the UFC. And lo and behold, in that video was Royce Gracie. Now, I can remember sitting back and watching that. And this was I think this was 94, 95 when I saw the video, but the fights took place in Colorado in 1993 and in Denver. And I remember looking at this VHS, putting it in the Betamax recorder, the buttons that you press. Some of you new school guys, the younger guys wouldn't even know what that is. And I watched this grainy video of Royce coming out in the Gracie train and climbing into the octagon where there were no rounds, no rules, no time limits, no points. Victory was by knockout or submission. And he literally depicted the whole thing. He literally went in there and took everyone apart, every art. Now, people will often say there wasn't any skilled opponents in there. Well, actually there were. Back then, it wasn't what it is today, which is a athlete against an athlete today. Some of the UFC fighters I have in my academy, they're specimens, they're athletes. Back then, if we go back to those early days, you had people like David Taboo, I think his name was, big Hawaiian guy. You had Tank Abbott. You had Remco Pardo. You had all of these guys. Now, they were all skilled in something. And Royce literally took them apart. And he was using what I knew to be traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. He was using elbows. He was slapping people, palm strikes, knees, kicks. And then when he got close to them, not only was he grappling with them, but he was actually using effective striking within that environment. So he wasn't just kind of hugging them and holding crossbody and not doing anything. He was actually striking them. The new school guys today, the emphasis isn't that. The emphasis is winning fights via points. And when the new school guys go into tournaments like the UFC, they're not doing so well anymore because their primary objective isn't striking and fundamental positions, mount escapes, elbow escapes, closed guard, taking the back. It's completely reliant on a lot of the sportive components. As I said in the previous podcast, Roger himself said in order for him to do better in the UFC, he would need to change some of the strategies and fighting concepts that he was using until he lost, especially to Tim Kennedy. So old school is a fundamentals. They spend a lot of time with fundamentals, a lot of heavy time with the basics, with fundamentals, with chaining a lot of stuff together, which doesn't really rely on points and system scoring. Now, I'll say that to say this. Back in those days, and I'm sounding like it's 100 years ago, and it isn't. We're talking the 90s. Back then, the submission ratio in tournaments wasn't huge. When tournament fighting began, it wasn't like back then everyone was being submitted. It wasn't like that. There were a lot of fights and people were outpointing each other. And if we see now, the submission rate has increased because the technicality of Jiu-Jitsu has increased. We're far more proficient in these sportive techniques. We have things like the evolution of Jiu-Jitsu. We have things like lapel wraps, worm guard, De La Riva guard, deep half guard. The list goes on. Z guard. There's so many. Every week a new guard will appear. And for me personally, what I see a lot is a lot of the new school guys are learning the new school techniques, but have no consideration for basic fundamental skills. I'll give another example. This evening I taught the beginner class at my academy. Within that class, there were 3 other black belts that were there. And one of the black belts in particular, who's been training approximately 10 years, he's not a black belt under us, but he's one of our black belts because he joined us at black belt, became part of our association, part of our family. And he said to me, in my whole 10 years of doing Jiu-Jitsu, I haven't seen these techniques. Why haven't I've seen these techniques? Maybe my teacher didn't know them, or maybe he didn't take time to show me them. Now, to me, that's really sad. That's a real sad state of affairs because the guy has really good knowledge of Jiu-Jitsu. He knows stuff well. For me, it's very modern Jiu-Jitsu, and he's an older guy. He's in his 50s. But he can develop and have better fundamentals, not just for him, for his students. He has a school. He had a successful school prior to COVID. So for me, I especially want to work with him. Now I have a zero politics, zero politics in my academy. People can come from any school. They can wear what gi patch they want, wear their own gi. And we have a set of rules. And those rules that are there are to keep everything unified and to keep everyone on a level playing field. So when the guys come in and train, I'm watching a lot of the time, or if I'm training with them, and they're amazing at these lapel guards and etc. etc. But there are fundamental flaws that I see, and I am not a world champion. I don't claim to be a world champion. I've never competed at any elite level, but I'm able to train and hang with elite level guys. I'm also a coach to some of these guys, some of the UFC fighters. In my association, my global association, we have world champions, IBJJF world champions, NAGA world champions, ADCC champions. And a lot of these guys come out of our school, which is located in Bucharest, Romania, Absoluta BJJ, which was one of the first schools to be opened in Romania. And there's a reason why I believe these guys do so well in competition, because their fundamentals are sound. It's a solid fundamental program that we have. Now, once we learn this fundamental program, we then start to add the newer school stuff in. We're not afraid of it. We're not shy of it. We play with the ashigaramis, with the leg locks, with the kimono entanglements. But the primary objective of traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, as taught when I was learning, was defense first. Be defensive over everything else. Once we can defend, we can then counterattack. Once we can counterattack, then we can start to impose our game and play our game. Now, a really good example that I can give you in recent times was during Metamoris, when Hiron Gracie fought Andre Galvao. Now, Andre Galvao is a very, very decorated Jiu-Jitsu competitor, has won, I think, almost every major competition in the last 10 years. He's an absolute specimen of a man. And he fought against one of the grandchildren of Grandmaster Elio Gracie, Hiron Gracie, who's a dear friend of mine. And Hiron used very, very simple Jiu-Jitsu. Andre Galvao didn't win. Hiron, although was under extreme pressure and in bad positions, did not get submitted. And that was a perfect clash of styles for our times, for these modern times. And there has been a few others. There's been a few other instances like that. If we look at in the sports jiu-jitsu world, you have another dear friend of mine, Saulo Ribeiro, who is an old school guy, uses old school jiu-jitsu, wins so many tournaments. His brother, Shanji Ribeiro. We have Megaton Diaz. We have, who else is there? Vinny Ayeta. There's so many of these guys. Now, I'm very, very grateful for my instructors. Hoyle Gracie, Hoist Gracie, Hickson Gracie, and of course, Grandmaster Elio Gracie. I was very, very fortunate to take a class with Grandmaster Elio Gracie 2 weeks before he passed away in Barcelona in Spain at Hobbin Gracie's Academy. And it was fundamental stuff. It was the old school stuff that was being taught in Brazil when I was there learning. So, is it valid? Well, absolutely it's valid, with this big push on, the self-defense stuff that I see coming back. I think it's moving in the correct way. Now, let's talk a little bit about the new school stuff. The new school stuff is amazing. We have kids coming out of academies and they are literally tearing up the competition scene. There are so many amazing athletes coming out now that 1 week it's someone, 1 week it's someone else, and I get lost with the names because, if I'm honest, I don't actually follow the sport stuff that much, but I kind of look at it just to see who's doing what at the moment. And there are some amazing guys. Keenan Cornelius. I mean, if you sent Keenan Cornelius back in time, I'm sure he would be winning tournaments and people would look at him like a god, like a jiu-jitsu god. All of these guys, they're incredible. The Mendez brothers. But I think where they fall down a little bit, or where they miss out, and this goes back to what Hickson was saying, is because they lack the self-defense aspects of jiu-jitsu, meaning while they're wrapping this worm guard and playing this position, there's no consideration for someone punching them in the face or elbowing them in the face or sticking their fingers in their eyes or whatever it is. There's no consideration for that. And I think that is what Hickson was talking about when Hickson was saying to me, these are amateur black belts. He's talking about it from a one perspective, the sport perspective. Now, maybe Keenan Cornelius does train with punches. I don't know enough about him. I know who he is and what he's capable of. But maybe he does train with punches. Who knows? Maybe these guys do train punches. The other thing I think in favor to the new school guys that has happened is, over the years, Jiu-Jitsu has become a science. I often refer to Jiu-Jitsu as martial science because we're physically attacking the anatomy of the body and dissecting it and making sure that we're able to manipulate it in the ways where we're going to cause the most effectiveness to that body. So breaking limbs, choking people's necks, snapping feet off. And I just think when Hickson spoke about that, he received a huge backlash. People were on him about that. They were like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he actually does. And I actually know what he means, and maybe he didn't translate that information so well, or transmit that information so well, but I actually do know what he's talking about, and I do agree with what he said. So the new school guys, they're inventing, these guys are scientists. They're inventing stuff, they're creating stuff. Every week there's something else. And I'm very fortunate, very privileged. I get to train with a lot of these guys who visit my school. And when they come in, I'm impressed. Some of these guys are absolutely incredible. Some of the grips they make and some of the ways they're using the sweeps, like old school sweeps that I've seen with a modern twist. And I like to share, I like to exchange knowledge with them and get an understanding of what they're trying to achieve and what they want. And I'm very, very privileged to be able to do that. Now, that conversation I had with that student went in a nutshell like this. we consider ourselves traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu because we practice the fundamentals. Now, our fundamentals are very, very basic. They have the 4 hierarchy positions: the mount, the crossbody, the closed guard, the back mount. Then you have the pieces in between those, which could be the half guard. They could be the quarter guard. They could be all of these little intricacies in between them. And we build our house on those foundations. We also then add striking into those positions. How to strike, how to not get struck, how to be defensive, how to position your hands so you're not going to be vulnerable or open to taking shots. We then have the stand-up self-defense. So we have takedowns, throws, striking, finally ground grappling as a last resort. And of course, there's a weapon defense program in there. The weapon defense program, a lot of people are like, oh, they're teaching weapons and they're teaching people that these people are going to get killed. Now, our primary thing for our students is any weapon comes out, hand over your wallet or leave the situation. If you can't leave for whatever reason, you have a family member there, a child there, an elderly person, and you're stuck there, at least have something that may work than have absolutely nothing that will for sure not work. So those are our primary objectives with traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Now with new school Jiu-Jitsu, what they have is, from my understanding, and I could be completely wrong because the schools I visit, the people I know within the industry, and remember, I'm a nothing black belt. In the world of Jiu-Jitsu, I'm a black belt who's among thousands of others. And this is just my own opinion, my own concepts. They don't have any idea of what it takes to defend punches or where the opportunities are to inflict damage. They also play a lot for the sportive aspect of Jiu-Jitsu, and they do incredibly well. They use the lapels a lot for their game, and their game is wrapped around rules, time limits, and rounds. Now, when we train, we teach our white belts footlocks. We teach them from an early stage footlocks, how to attack, how to defend, what to be aware of, where the dangers are. We don't wait for that to come in at blue or purple belt level. And some schools refer to, this position is an advanced position for advanced students. Well, all we have is fundamentals and then advanced fundamentals. That's what we have. We have a fundamental class, an intermediate class, and then an advanced class. The only difference with all of those are the levels that attend those classes and the application of the techniques that are applied in those classes during live sparring. It's the only difference. And then they get to drill these and repeat these with higher level guys and the sparring, etc., etc. Now, in the flip side of that is, you could say, well, our white belts spar with all levels all the way through, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we have a saying in our gym, and that saying is, practice makes permanent. If you permanently practice something incorrectly, it becomes permanently installed in your game. And we want to negate that at a very, very early stage. No one came into my school and said, yep, I want to be a world champion. And I'm serious. And this is since having a school from 2002. No one came in and said that to me. The people that walked through my doors, because of the way we promote our academy and what we do, they come in and say, I want to learn to protect myself. And we tell them. And I've had people say to me, listen, what do you guys do about competition and etc.? And I said to them, if your primary objective is competition, this really isn't the school for you. There are many other schools. You can Google search them and you'll find them. And they're out there. And I'm very honest and very open with these students when they come in about their objectives. I don't want to missell them anything. I want them to get exactly what they're looking for. Now, we're also very fortunate to have 9 black belts at my academy. So at the headquarters in London, we have 9 black belts, different ages, different abilities. They're not all housed there, but in total, who come to train with us, they're all my black belts. And each one of those black belts have very, very strong fundamentals. Each one of those black belts can teach, and each one of those black belts range from the age of 60 down to 30. So we have that age group here, so everyone can relate to them. And our 60-year-olds can go on the mat and train and not get injured with the young guys. They don't need to tough it out. They don't need to duke it out with these guys and prove their worth because they are black belts. So, in surmise to what I've been talking about, traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu consists of 5 simple components: striking, clinching, takedowns, throwing, and finally ground grappling. All of those things are traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Surrounding that is the mindset that makes all of that work. And then we also have the weapon self-defense part of our curriculum. And of course, as I just said, we have a curriculum that governs all of that. Modern day Jiu-Jitsu doesn't have that. It doesn't have that, and it's not any better and it's not any worse. It's different. And people are going to argue, it's the same, it's the same. Come into our class and take a lesson. And, we have an open door policy. We're a non-political movement. Come into our class, take a lesson and see what's different and what's the same. And there will be similarities, for sure. But I can guarantee that it is very different. It's very, very different in the sense that we're preparing for the street, we're preparing for a potential confrontation outside, and that's our primary focus. Now, I'm not saying these guys cannot do well, the new school guys. I'm not saying they can't do well if a fight broke out, and it's just a decision process within that fight that could go bad for them. For example, jumping guard, going for a foot lock in the street, going for an arm lock in the street. All of this stuff can potentially, make you lose the fight, especially if you don't understand the mindset of fighting. Now, I'm no guru, like I said, when it comes to this, but I have a good understanding, and there's a reason why so many MMA fighters come to our gym, that we've been able to create Bellator champions, that we've been able to work alongside other coaches when it comes to MMA, that we're able to have guys compete at good levels and medal, that we have guys that can go and win world championships. And that is what I see as the fundamental difference, that our guys can go and enter all of these arenas. Now, do we roll the same way? Absolutely. Absolutely. The only difference is when we're rolling, we're not thinking about points, we're thinking about submission. And when we're rolling, we're also thinking about, can we strike here? Can they strike us? Are we vulnerable? Can we get up from that situation if we need? Do we have to stay embroiled in this position? Guys, that's all I have for you for today. Listen, it's my very first video podcast. It's very, very different from standing in front of a camera and teaching a technique. This is a kind of intimate one-on-one thing. I hope you like the setup behind me. It took me a while to figure out where to do this, how to make it look good. I watched a lot of YouTube videos just to see how they did it, and I took some advice from some friends of mine. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have some value from it, and I hope it made sense to you. Please don't forget to subscribe and follow me on all social media platforms at EKBJJ. And also don't forget to shoot me a message. Let me know if there's anything you want me to discuss or anyone you'd like me to bring in to have a conversation with. Now we have this video platform. Big thank you to Spotify and Anchor for giving me this platform and this privilege to be part of, some of the first people to make this monumental video podcasting happen. I'm very honored and I'm very proud to be here and serve the community of Jiu-Jitsu. Guys, until next time, take care.